Hi, I'm Dan Barker. That sign said Coffee and Conversation with Andrew Seidel, which is coming up in a second. I'm the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Since when was that? Back in 2004. I joined the staff in 1987. So I'm still a newcomer here at FFRF. And this is FFRF's weekly Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live. Today is Wednesday, April the 7th. And yesterday, April the 6th, was a really big day for us here at FFRF. We had a number of things happen, besides the fact that our Ron Reagan ad, which you just saw, ran last night on the Rachel Maddow show. We also had a big victory in Alabama, a significant state church victory, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. And then next week, our show next week is going to be about that Alabama victory, about voting rights in Alabama for atheists. And we also yesterday, on April the 6th, which is the 3-month, what do you call it, a month-anniversary? Anniversary? What do you call it? A 3-month anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. Yesterday, we had a full-page ad in the New York Times, and there it is there. One nation under God. January 6th was a faith-based initiative. Full color, full page ad showing the Christians there at the cross. They're praying. You can see that as they are invading our capital. They're praying in the name of Jesus. And also yesterday was the debut of a new, we're testing it out, a new show, a new Zoom show called Coffee and Conversation. And it's going to be a monthly show. And if you like it, we'll keep doing it. Yesterday, we debuted with Andrew Seidel talking about the January 6th insurrection and why it truly was a faith-based initiative. So today, we are going to watch part of that Coffee and Conversation show that aired yesterday with Andrew Seidel. And there's questions and answers during that. And if you want to make some questions today, live today, I'll be watching this show on my phone here, and I might be able to respond to you in the comments to Facebook. But otherwise, I hope you really enjoy watching this, because Andrew did a wonderful job of delineating and explaining the real problem behind it. There were many other problems, but let's listen to Andrew Seidel, Coffee and Conversation, about the January 6th faith-based initiative.
So it's not often, I haven't heard of it happening to many authors, that you choose a subtitle for a book and then the subject runs out to prove you right. But exactly 3 months ago, Christian nationalists attacked American democracy and attempted to overturn the results of a free and fair election, and proved beyond all doubt that Christian nationalism is un-American. Christian nationalism ripped off its mask, showing that it is not this scholarly debate about how America was founded, but a violent, exclusionary movement bent on seizing power here and now. That insurrection launched the conversation that some of us, Andrew Whitehead, Sam Perry, Catherine Stewart, Robbie Jones, Chrissy Stroop, Sarah Posner, Michelle Goldberg, Jack Jenkins, Jeff Charlotte, and many more, had been having in the margins into the mainstream. And since January 6th, I have been scouring photos and videos and court cases. Just kind of dipping a toe into this world is alarming, but I have immersed myself in it, and I am more convinced than ever about the role that Christian nationalism played in attacking our democracy. And I'm sure many of you, like me, watched in horror as that assault unfolded. But I really want to set this stage a bit to remind us all of just a taste of the Christian nationalism from that day. So Paula White began the day with a prayer. And in true Christian nationalist fashion, she added the United States of America to the Lord's Prayer that is written down in Matthew 6. She added America to a prayer that, according to the Bible, Jesus himself prescribed and crafted. In that same chapter, by the way, Jesus also tells people to pray in private and not in public, like the hypocrites praying to be seen by others. But Christian nationalists always seem to ignore that biblical command. The rally that began with that prayer ended with Trump calling on his mob to march to the Capitol. His last words were the same ones that Nixon used to distract this country from Watergate. God bless you and God bless America. Impromptu worship concerts broke out on the short walk to the Capitol. On their march to the Capitol, the Proud Boys were hailed as God's warriors and knelt in prayer, full of typical Christian nationalist rhetoric about restoring the nation. They marched and then they attacked. One attacker carried a Christian flag onto the floor of the Senate. The absurdly self-proclaimed QAnon shaman led a prayer in the Senate about patriotism, Jesus, and restoring the nation, ending the prayer in Jesus' name. One of those praying insurrectionists gave an interview later and talked about that same prayer, saying of the Senate, quote, "We consecrated it to Jesus. That to me was the ultimate statement of where we are in this movement." And indeed it is. A third praying insurrectionist posted a video saying, "I just wanted to get inside the building so I could plead the blood of Jesus over it. That was my goal." In that video, he spends 40 minutes recounting every act, most of it pleading the blood, but he attributes every action to this dialogue that he had with Jesus. And he recounts that dialogue in the video. God told him to do it. He also said that he would start a prison ministry when he was sent away for his crimes. Another insurrectionist, sipping a post-assault beer, told her social media followers exactly why she attacked the beating heart of American democracy. "To me," quote, she said, "to me," quote, "to me, God and country are tied. To me, they're one and the same. We're founded as a Christian country, and we see how far we've come from that. We are a godly country, and we are founded on godly principles." And the idea that we are a Christian country and that we've slipped from those founding principles is a central tenet of Christian nationalism and their primary justification for harmful, retrogressive public policy, as well as assaulting democracy. And, again, the imagery from the day is now infamous. A huge wooden cross juxtaposed with the gallows from which they wanted to hang our elected officials. They actually signed the gallows as if it were a yearbook, writing on it, "Hang them high, in God we trust, God bless the USA, hang for treason and amen." The flags and signs were clear. Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, one nation under God, in God we trust, Jesus saves, Jesus 2020. There were Bible verses and crosses. One sign simply said, "I am on your side, God." There were Catholic images of Jesus or Mary on banners, paintings, and statues, some borne atop poles over the heads of the attackers. A Bible was raised above the crowd like a Napoleonic eagle as the mob surged through one of the entrances. One of the people who entered the Capitol was a Catholic, the demon Baphomet, while he was inside. Another was a youth pastor from Florida. Others were missionaries. They sang the battle hymn of the Republic, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on," and prayed in the rotunda. One group, the Jericho March, had been founded by two federal workers who were sent visions from God to, quote, "let the church roar." The Battle of Jericho was a genocide. In the story, the biblical God orders his followers to march around the city while blowing shofars, ram's horns, and carrying the ark holding his commandments, and then orders them to violently sack the city, steal all the valuables, and murder every living thing, including animals. So the Jericho March, which was formed after Trump lost, baptized itself after this biblical genocide and then sought to reenact the slaughter by blowing shofars, marching around government buildings in DC and at state capitals, and declaring that we are one nation under God, and organizing rallies alongside the Stop the Steal charlatans. And it wasn't just imagery and rhetoric. It was a devout belief that this is a Christian nation and that God chose Donald Trump. I mean, remember, Trump himself looked up and said, "I am the chosen one." Remember this? That God was on their side. The attacker who kicked in Speaker Pelosi's door, hoping to, quote, tear her into little pieces was an attorney, and his rantings were actually recounted at one of his hearings after he was charged. He said, quote, "God is on Trump's side. God is not on the Democrats' side. And if patriots have to kill 60 million of these communists, it is God's will." Now, there were, of course, other motivations for the attack. There were other drivers of the attack. But the Christian nationalist permission structure, doing God's will, fighting for God's law, returning this country to its Christian roots, pervaded those other obvious drivers of the attack. For instance, the insurrection had this distinct QAnon flavor. But study after study is now exposing the link between QAnon and Christian nationalism and or white evangelicalism. And this was a largely white crowd too. The Black Lives Matter protesters in DC neither received nor expected such leniency that summer when they were protesting. When the looting starts, the shooting starts, Trump warned in May 2020, quoting a phrase that's got a very long and racist history. Trump had those peaceful protesters gassed, beaten, and brutalized with rubber bullets so that he could walk to a church and pose with a Bible for a photo. And the point of that malignant stroll was to show that we are a Bible-believing, Bible-beating Christian nation, and anybody else who disagrees should be beaten and gassed. So to speak of Christian nationalism is really to speak of white Christian nationalism. And this was a privileged mob that roamed the halls without fear. They were brazenly entitled. Perhaps they mistakenly believed that Trump would pardon them, but they certainly believed that this is their country, given to them by their God, and that they are acting on his orders and defending his chosen one. And when reality collides with a belief system like that, violence is almost inevitable. So entitlement and violence, and all of that is based on disinformation. The entire Christian nationalist identity is based on disinformation, right? It's not a scholarly debate about our history. It's a sinister, exclusionary movement. It is an attempt to redefine America according to the Christian nationalist identity and disinformation, and then reshape our law accordingly. And you've heard the disinformation before. If you've ever seen me talk before, you've heard me talk about it many times, that we're one nation under God. In God we trust, that the Declaration of Independence references the Christian God 4 different times, that they prayed at the Constitutional Convention, that George Washington got down on his knees in the snow at Valley Forge and prayed, that our laws are based on the Golden Rule, which comes from Christianity, and that our laws are also based on the 10 Commandments. None of that is true. And without their origin myths, their identity begins to wither. Their entire political and ideological reality is actually vulnerable because it is based on that disinformation. And that becomes really clear when you explore the myths and the lies that undergird this truly un-American political ideology. So it's not just that the identity is based on disinformation. It's bigger than that. It's that the Judeo-Christian principles, and especially those that are central to the identity, are thoroughly opposed to the principles on which the United States was built. Now, before I open this up to questions and we can have a little bit more of a conversation, I just want to talk about one of the more common myths that I always see a little bit this time of year that I just mentioned, that this identity is based on. So let's talk about how the 10 Commandments fundamentally conflict with our nation's core principles. Sure, some of the 10 Commandments overlap with criminal laws that prohibit murder and theft and perjury, including laws probably in your state. But those rules are not exclusive or original to Judeo-Christianity. There are universal human principles that every successful society we know of has adopted. And there's actually some really compelling evidence to suggest that the biblical version of those prohibitions didn't apply to anyone but fellow believers. In other words, the biblical version of these universal principles was not universal. Either way, it's very hard to credibly claim that the biblical iterations of those universal rules influenced the American founding. And the rest of the 10 Commandments are downright un-American. They begin, "I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me." That divine command embodies principles that directly conflict with the principles that founded the United States. No law can tell an American to worship a god, let alone which god. We are free to be godless, and a growing number are, or we can, if we wish, worship every god from every holy book. And the commandments continue in this un-American vein. They prohibit free expression and art, the graven images or idols. They prohibit free speech, taking the Lord's name in vain. They sanction slavery twice in Exodus 20:10 and 17. The Ten Commandments even promise to punish innocent children to the third and fourth generation if parents are brazen enough to exercise the religious freedom guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The 10th commandment is perhaps the worst. It condones slavery, treats women as chattel, and criminalizes thought. And incidentally, most of the Ten Commandments monuments that you see in public spaces or on government property edit out these more horrific parts of the Ten Commandments. And just think for a second about what a damning statement that is. We use our morality to cut out the immoral parts of the Ten Commandments, including the two mentions of slavery and punishing innocent children. We are more moral than God's most moral laws, according to the stone monuments they put up. And they don't even realize this. It's kind of great. And the comparison between Christianity and the American constitutional system continues like this. I could list plenty more, but I really do want to get to questions, so I'm going to start wrapping this up. We can beat Christian nationalism. We can relegate it back to the fringe whence it came by exposing the disinformation that feeds the identity. We won't convince all Christian nationalists to change, but we can alert most of the country to the danger and prevent our government from giving aid and succor to the un-American identity that assaulted our democracy. Again, this entire identity is based on lies and myths, but it is validated by modern representations of the myths that previous Christian nationalists have imposed on this country during crises. Their erroneous beliefs are validated when they see "In God We Trust" on our money or on a government building, or when they're told as school children that this is one nation under God. When Congress opens with prayers, that assures every Christian nationalist that this is indeed his America. The Ten Commandments monuments that sit on government property and proclaim, "I am the Lord thy God." The Christian nationalist identity draws legitimacy from these artifacts left by previous waves of Christian nationalism forced on the country. And really, these relics are disfiguring scars, which ought to remind us that Christian nationalists have justified slavery, sanctified segregation, and now inspired an insurrection. Instead, those scars reinforce an un-American identity. And until we erase those scars, we are giving aid and comfort to a traitor to the American philosophy. America is a shared idea. That's what we are at our most basic level. America is a shared idea. And Christian nationalism refuses to share. It excludes non-Christians and the wrong kind of Christians. America will never be a Christian nation because the moment it becomes a Christian nation, it will cease to be America. The two cannot peacefully coexist. One will triumph. This is the choice that we face as a nation: Christian nationalism or America. We cannot have both. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to assume you're all clapping now. I'm going to take a moment to take a sip of coffee here, and we're going to get to questions in just a second. I want to do two quick housekeeping notes. First, there's a lot more information in my book, The Founding Myth, right back there. The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. That subtitle that point proven on January 6th. And as many of you will remember, that book was burned by a Christian nationalist preacher, a guy named Greg Locke. He was there in DC on January 5th. He said a prayer for the Proud Boys. It was this very militant prayer. You know, the leap from burning books to, you know, kind of stoking an insurrection is apparently a pretty short step, actually. If you would like to get a signed copy of the book that scared the man who stoked the fires of insurrection to the point where he took a blowtorch to the book, you can do that through FFRF's website. Lauren or Christina is going to post in the chat a link to where you can get that book. And I will sign it for you. If you would like me to personalize it, I can do that as well. You just have to leave a little note when you're checking out. There's a comment box that'll pop up, and you can just say, Andrew, please, write something in there. I can do it to Tom or to Christina, whoever, whatever you want. They also make a great gift. And basically, I mean, we're talking collector's items here. And then second, my first interaction with Locke came because of FFRF's Ron Reagan ad. I suggested that we air it during the debates, and that really upset Mr. Locke. And that commercial, as you probably know, it ends, Ron Reagan, unabashed atheist, not afraid of burning in hell. And that line was all Ron. And now FFRF has this line of bumper stickers and t-shirts, and we have these cool mugs. So if you didn't get a chance to see this, these are amazing handmade mugs. If you know anything about me, you know that I get up at 5 a.m. every morning to write. Coffee is a must. So I consider myself something of a connoisseur of good mugs, and this mug really is excellent. It's handmade, well insulated, and it has this kind of like reassuring heft to it. So you can get one of those. That will also be in the chat, or you can go to ffrf.us/mug.
I'm not an atheist, I'm a pantheist, so it's a little different thing, but for all practical purposes, I say, thank God I'm an atheist. So it's that kind of a thing. I'm spiritual, but I definitely do not believe in the Christian God at all. But it's interesting is they talk about how now we have less than 50% of people go to church. That's a big theme that came out this last week. As one pastor responded to that by saying, hey, this is not a good thing because they're going to go and follow some crazy false prophets, that the church keeps them sane. And if they're leaving the church, but they're not necessarily becoming atheists, what they're becoming is crazy Christians that have no clue to what the gospel really about. So how do we deal with that kind of an attitude of why we have to support the church? Because it's even worse to have them go away into some kind of social media,
Yeah, I mean, the underlying premise of that counter argument by I don't know exactly which one you're mentioning, but this argument was made a lot after the Gallup poll was published. Essentially, look, this is a bad thing. People need church, or hey, this actually doesn't necessarily mean people are becoming non-religious, just that they're not going to church as much, and who knows what's filling that void. And the first thing I want to point out is there is no God-shaped hole in human beings. If there were a God-shaped hole, if we needed religion, right? The church wouldn't tell you to have to come back every single week. That wouldn't have been enforced by law and by fire for millennia, right? But we need community, which is not the same as needing religion. Religion is just a subset of the community need. We are social animals. So that's number one. We don't need religion. We don't need church. And number two is that Gallup poll is, and they were very careful to say this, Gallup was, in its analysis, part of an overall trend of people leaving religion. And they wanted to point out, one, that this is not necessarily just attributable to the COVID pandemic, because they actually, if you want to get into it a little bit, they average over 3 years what the numbers are. But also, part of an overall trend that really started in about 20 years ago of people leaving religion. I mean, the truth is Americans are finally waking up to the fact that religion is not something they need and is often a deeply harmful social construct. So I'm very heartened by the Gallup poll. It's another data piece in that overall slide of America finally waking up and leaving religion behind. Thank you for that question, Peter. Great question.
Hey, thank you so much for your work. This is incredibly insightful.
Thank you,
my
Frank.
question goes to the origins of these beliefs. And you've touched on these points in your discussion. It's obviously well known that religion provides that sense of community and social constructs that we need as human beings. But I'm just curious if you could speak to the motivations behind that. Are people drawn into this movement solely because of ideology and their beliefs and the traditions, or are there ulterior motives where it's a vehicle for people to begin to exercise control and gain power over people, and of course the acquisition of wealth. The church is extremely
Sure.
wealthy.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of an age-old question, and I think it's probably. I think we can say that by and large, most of the people genuinely believe this on some level. The flock, let's say. Otherwise, it wouldn't be useful or profitable for the leaders. But the question of do the leaders we don't even have to limit it to Christian nationalism. I mean, this is something we think about with mega church preachers and these prosperity gospel preachers all the time. Do they really believe what they're spouting, or are they just doing it to get rich quick? I mean, it's sort of this perennial question. And I mean, I don't know the answer. I don't know that we'll ever know the answer unless you get a hot mic moment or a tape. And even then, it's not something that you're going to be able to apply to everyone. And I tend to think that it's probably a mix. I think there are probably some of each. Either way, it doesn't necessarily alter how we are going to push back and our strategy for from taking the power back from this movement and from those preachers. So it's a fascinating question, but I guess, Frank, the bottom line is I don't know, and I don't know that we will ever know. I'm sure there are some that are disingenuous, and I'm sure that there are a few that believe. I also think it's worth pointing out, right, that people's beliefs change over time. I mean, Dan Barker, FFRF co-president, was a devout believer who slowly, went away from religion, and now has helped found something called the Clergy Project, which has these hundreds, perhaps thousands now, people who are religious leaders preaching in the pulpit today that are atheists, that don't believe, but they don't know how to get out of the system that they're stuck in. So I think we also need to always kind of keep that in mind. We like to categorize people and say, okay, you're this, and then kind of move on, but people's beliefs change over time too. Thanks, Frank. It's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer for you, but the bottom line is I don't know.
You said that it was quite disturbing to completely immerse yourself in the Christian nationalism since the attack on the Capitol. Mm-hmm. So what's the worst thing you have experienced?
That's a hard one. I mean, so what I've been doing, I've been looking through, watching, I mean, there are a lot more videos and photos and interviews from the insurrection than I think most people realize. The stuff you see in the news articles barely scratches the surface. For instance, ProPublica scraped all the videos of the insurrection off of Parler, sort of the Christian nationalist conservative version of Twitter before that shut down. And you can see all these different videos. I mean, there's hours of footage from that day that most people don't realize exists. And then I've also read through most, probably not all, of the charging documents and the affidavits in the court cases involving the people who actually attacked at the Capitol. And those are still rolling in today. And it's hard to pick out one that is that I would say is the worst, but there are a few that certainly stand out. One of the uber white nationalist assaulters wore a Proud Boys t-shirt, flashed that white power hands signal, talked about wanting to be a lone wolf killer. And he was actually on parole. He shouldn't have even been able to get to DC, but he got to DC by telling his parole officer he was going to go distribute Bibles for Gideon's International. That was the excuse he used. And so his parole officer let him go ahead and go to DC. And this is a person who professed to want to be a lone wolf killer and likened himself to some of these really scary people and events. And he used religion as an excuse. It was just a really palpable example. I mentioned the attorney who kicked in Speaker Pelosi's door, wanting to tear her, quote, into little pieces, and the language that he used at the beginning. I think people don't realize how tied the violence is to the belief that God is on your side. I think this is something the media has been unwilling to really explore fully in depth, because the media is often unwilling to seem critical of religion. But to me, that is probably the most alarming thread that runs through it. I mean, and it's obvious too, right? Like the Jericho March organized many of these events, and they named themselves after a genocide. I mean, you don't get more clear than that. They held this huge rally in D.C. that was sort of the prototypical rally. Really helped stoke a lot of these these feelings in people. I mean, and they almost every speaker there, and you would recognize all of them as Christian nationalists, talked about the Battle of Jericho in these glowing terms, and it is a genocide. They so deeply believe it that they don't even. It's almost like they don't consider it violence because they're doing it in their God's name. I mean, it is scary. The Voltaire quote that Jamie Raskin also mentioned when he was Representative Jamie Raskin mentioned when he was doing the impeachment trial. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That paraphrase, that's from Voltaire's Questions on Miracles, and it's obviously written in French, so this is our popular paraphrase. I mean, but it is accurate. That paraphrase is accurate, and that for me is the most disturbing. And you see it time and time again when you're swimming in that toxic world. Thank you, Lita.
I encounter many people who are unaware of the Christian connection to the insurrection. You know, people who watch mainstream media. Why is the mainstream media so reluctant to make that connection to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think part of it is just a basic sort of self-preservation instinct. You know, I mean, the majority of the country is still religious in one way, shape, or form, and I think to be seen to be criticizing the majority of the country might hurt their bottom line. I think that's a simple part of it. There are a lot of the reporters who cover religion are religious themselves. Is probably another small portion of the explanation for that. I think it's kind of hard. It's hard to pin down. The one other thing I will say is that Christian nationalism, the new popular argument against Christian nationalism is that it is not Christian. And this is something that you probably heard a lot more of, that it was a perversion of Christianity, the people who were attacking the Capitol, that no true Christian would do something like this. And that is a popular argument that we've seen time and time again in response to previous waves of Christian nationalism. And I do get into this a little bit in The Founding Myth. It's something I'd certainly like to explore more. And I think that argument's good in one way. The no true Christian argument helps liberalize American Christianity, which is, I mean, it's a great thing for human progress, right? But it comes at a cost to our country, because that argument, it splits Christianity into competing political camps. And there's actually good evidence that American Christianity seems to be reorganizing, not around sectarian lines, but around political parties. But as then Christianity advances, it leaves behind these footholds, these government stamps of approval, these Christian relics that Christian nationalists impose on our country, and on our children during times of fear and crisis. And then when they have these later waves of Christian nationalism, they can point to "In God We Trust." They can point to one nation under God and say, "Look, see, we are right about this." And so by saying that it is not Christian, you may advance the religious argument, but you don't advance the argument for our country at all. This is one of the reasons I chose the subtitle for the book that I did, that I wanted to take on this argument that Christian nationalism is un-American. I think that is the more effective way for us to fight against it. But I mean, the bottom line is, yes, you're right that the media is reluctant to criticize religion in any way, shape, or form. And when they do, they tend to do that no true Scotsman fallacy instead of recognizing it for what it is. I mean, Christian nationalism was a faith-based initiative, and this is a great time for me. Richard and I did not coordinate this, but it's also a great time to mention that FFRF is actually publishing today in the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times advertisements that say this. We use the phrase, we talk about Christian nationalism and the attack on the Capitol and say that it was a faith-based initiative. So we are not shying away from it, and we're putting we're putting that message in the media. I mean, we're paying to do so. But it is absolutely worth doing. So thank you, Richard, for that opportunity to pitch FFRF's ads. Anyway, the news release is probably already out. Maybe Lauren or Christina can go find it and put it in the chat for everybody.
We're just asking about, I had read an article about Christian nationalism, Christian nationalists in particular, being very reluctant to go ahead and get the vaccine, mainly for religious reasons. And I was just kind of curious, how do you think that's going to play out in the future, given that we're going to need vaccination proof, a card to travel? Is that going to be a Supreme Court fight? And how is that going to play out?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it is. I think there will be legal fights around it. First, so yes, and actually, the New York Times just published an article about how white evangelicals are really driving this vaccine reluctance. Is the nice phrase for it, I believe, and that's actually not quite accurate. When Trump won in 2020, everybody pointed to that 81% of white evangelicals that supported him as the sort of the driving force of that election. That number was taken from exit polls and turned out to be slightly lower in reality, but still very high. But the better predictor, better than being a white evangelical, was thinking that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and that is the defining characteristic of a Christian nationalist. So being a Christian nationalist was a better predictor of a Trump voter in 2016 than being a white evangelical. And the same thing can be said of people who hold these vaccine reluctant views, and people who take risks when it comes to COVID, who are willing to go out and eat in restaurants at the height of the pandemic, who don't anti-maskers. So it's the white evangelicals is sort of it misses the point slightly. It really is Christian nationalists. And Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry have done extensive research on this, on both of those in 2016 election, and the sort of risky behavior surrounding COVID. So you can check out their studies on those 2 points. I do think it will be a Supreme Court or a legal fight at some point. I mean, the real danger here, right, is if we don't get to some sort of herd immunity with vaccines, and I'm not a doctor, so pardon me if I'm using the wrong terms. I'm not talking about getting herd immunity by letting everybody get sick. The virus can continue to mutate and change, and we're going to see more and more of these variants. It's one of the reasons we need to do this as quickly as we can. And they are a huge roadblock to that, as they have been throughout this pandemic, taking multiple cases to the Supreme Court, arguing that they should be able to meet in person because people also have to go to the grocery stores to get food, which is not the same thing as going to a church and sitting in the pews and singing for an hour. It's just not even close to the same thing. But they've taken those cases all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is something I'm exploring in the new book that I'm writing. I'm getting up at 5 a.m. to write, and I've got my coffee every morning. I'm writing a book called Weaponizing Religious Freedom, and a big chunk of it so far, the draft, has been on this attempt to weaponize religious freedom as it pertains to the COVID fight. So I'm not exactly sure how it's going to play out with the vaccine, but I think you're absolutely right, Kristen, to believe that is going to end up being a legal fight at some point. I mean, we just saw that Governor Greg Abbott, who is more than happy to jump on the Christian nationalist bandwagon at every turn, said I think he passed a law or signed a law somehow banning vaccine passports, which, I mean, I've traveled extensively internationally, and you got to get vaccines to go places. That's just the way it is. So anyway, good question. We will see. You're right to look at it, and certainly stay tuned to FFRF, because we will be fighting and informing on that very issue.
My question goes back to the QAnon connection to Christian nationalism. Just wondering how many, if FFRF has been tracking how many posts from the anonymous Q over the past few years have been specifically Christian nationalist in tone. Kind of getting back to what you were talking about, that there's probably a lot of denial out there from progressive and moderate Christians that QAnon and the storming of the Capitol had anything to do with Christian.
Yeah, I haven't specifically gotten into that. I did at one time go through some of those posts, and there is some pretty overt Christian nationalism in there. I mean, it was also, I'm sure everybody saw it was on display at the Capitol as well. One of the most memorable moments for me from the Capitol was a woman in a red MAGA hat was carrying probably like a 4-foot tall portrait of white Jesus, you know, that white American Jesus portrait, and they had photoshopped onto the Jesus a red, also MAGA hat, you know, and on Jesus's white robes, there's this QAnon has this WWG1WGA is sort of their rallying cry acronym thing. It doesn't matter what it stands for, but you know, I mean, the woman was carrying this portrait along with her Trump hat, along with her Trump. I mean, so it's Trump, it's MAGA, it's QAnon, it's Jesus, sort of all rolled into one. It's almost the perfect image for that that sign. There were other people who also had signs that were very clearly linked the two. If everybody remembers that the bedazzled self-proclaimed QAnon shaman, you know, he held up a sign at a protest in Arizona shortly after the election that said, "Hold the line, patriots, God wins." And then on the flip side of it said, "Q sent me." And I mean, you know, and this is a guy who, again, he calls himself Q Shaman. He's a failed actor. I mean, he gave an interview with the BBC shortly after the insurrection. He said, "I've done nothing wrong. I have truth and God on my side." He told the FBI that he was able to get in the Senate, quote, "by the grace of God." Right. So, I mean, it goes back to that central belief that they believe they're doing God's work, and that's what's motivating them. And that's why they feel so entitled and privileged to break the law. So, I mean, it is... the two are intimately related, and there are multiple studies that are now coming out that are showing this sort of intimate, incestuous relationship between Christian nationalism and white evangelicalism and QAnon. But FFRF has not done anything formal on exploring the posts specifically. I have looked at them, and I can tell you there are some there are overt Christian nationalist moments in those posts, but we haven't gotten into it too much, no.
My question is, how can we dismantle this idea of ceremonial deism that people are using to say, oh, the cross isn't really Christian, oh, it doesn't really signify? What can we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it goes back to one of the ways that I think we need to be talking about Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism assaulted our democracy, and it draws legitimacy from ceremonial deism. For people who aren't familiar with that term, it's sort of a term that courts and legal scholars have adopted to essentially describe things that are clear violations of the separation of state and church, but they're kind of small, so we're going to go ahead and let them slide. Things like adopting "In God We Trust" as the national motto, or adding "Under God" to the pledge, or saying a prayer before the legislative body opens, be it a state legislature or Congress. Essentially, it's saying, like, look, this is so small, we're not going to worry about it. And I mean, that's fundamentally not true. And it's also wildly hypocritical. I mean, right, like, just pause to imagine for a moment if a court did with John 3:16, or praying the rosary, what it has done with "In God We Trust" and "One Nation Under God." Imagine if a court said, yeah, we've heard John 3:16 so many times that through rote repetition, it's lost all religious significance. It's not really religious anymore. I mean, that would piss every single Christian in the country off, to have a federal court declaring that, the Bible verse that sums up their religion is not religious. And rightfully so. They would be right to be upset about that. And right to challenge it in court if they wanted. But that same fiction has been employed to defend these so-called smaller violations, which again are not small. But I think one of the things that we can do, first, we already talked about the Gallup poll, and we already mentioned that the country is going away from religion. I think that is going to help us on that fight, because while we may not win in court anytime soon, especially the way the courts have been packed, we need court reform now. We certainly can win through democratic reforms, small d democratic reforms, not political partisan democratic reforms. So I think that, and then the second last point on that is we can tie these things directly to Christian nationalism. Under God was imposed on the country during a wave of Christian nationalism in the 1950s, also giving us the National Day of Prayer and a whole host of other Christian nationalist relics. In God We Trust was first added to our coins by 3 Christian nationalists, including one who wanted to amend the Constitution to add Jesus's name to it. During the 1863, really, and then finally it was done in 1864. I mean, pointing that these things are Christian they were imposed on the country during times of fear and national crisis by Christian nationalists, and that Christian nationalists draw their legitimacy. I mean, I saw and have seen so many "In God We Trust" and "One Nation Under God" signs and speeches related to this insurrection. You would not believe it. I think we need to hang that around their neck and continue to hammer it over and over again.
I also have a question from Daryl Barker. Daryl, this is not going to be using his mic. I'm just going to read his question for him.
Hi, Daryl.
Hey, Daryl. Seems to me that with church attendance at an all-time, I don't know if it says low these days, do you know of any out atheist that has the interest and abilities to successfully run and win for president of the United States? Who would you suspect could win?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't know of any out atheist that really identifies and uses and adopts that label. There are certainly non-religious members of Congress right now. There's the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which has formed a few years ago and is growing, though you don't have to be non-religious to be a member of that. I mean, Jamie Raskin does not identify as an atheist, but is a co-founder of the Free Thought Caucus and has really, I think, elevated his reputation in the eyes of much of the country with what he did after the insurrection and during the insurrection itself. So, I mean, that is probably the possibility that maybe most likely jumps to mind. I'm going to add just a couple things. One, historically, there have been times when the United States was less churched, especially around the founding, but not necessarily by the same study. So the Gallup study only goes back to, I believe, the early 1930s, but don't quote me on that. There are other studies looking at the population of the Americas during the 1770s, 80s, 90s that suggest that, like less than a fifth of the people were formally churched. There's a lot of argument among historians about where exactly that would fall. And I'll also just say that I think we are coming up on a demographic tipping point. The default has always been, I'm a Christian. So if you ask somebody, what are you? Even if they're not really religious, the default has always been, I'm a Christian. And that default is changing. And I think once we're going to hit a critical mass soon, and that change is going to accelerate. So the trend away from religion has been going like this, and I actually think it's going to start going like this once we hit that tipping point. I've talked to several demographers and sociologists. I don't have a good source for this, but I can tell you that informally, most of them agree with that analysis. That's not just, I don't just go spout things that I'm not entirely sure of without some checking on my part. So it's something to look forward to. The demographics are really in our favor right now, and the trends as well.
This is from Marcy Shaver. I've heard Hi, Marcy. I've heard that paganism is becoming the favored religion of white supremacy. How does that fit into the picture?
Yeah, there are overlaps. I'm certainly not an expert in paganism or white supremacy for that matter. But Christian nationalism and the overlap with white supremacy is, you know, if you were looking at that as a Venn diagram, it's pretty damn close to a circle. Robbie Jones, who runs PRRI and wrote The End of White Christian America and White Too Long, which is a book about white supremacy and the church he grew up in, really likes to not say Christian nationalism, but say white Christian nationalism. And when we speak of Christian nationalism, when I speak of it, I am speaking of white Christian nationalism. And the data backs this up too. If you are a Black American asked, do you think the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and say yes, that vision is very different from the vision of a white person, white American, who also thinks the United States was founded as a Christian nation. And the data backs that up, and Perry and Whitehead have done some great breakdowns of that in their research. So I think there is a massive overlap. I don't feel qualified to speak on paganism. I mean, they've adopted a lot of those symbols, certainly, but beyond that, I'm not going to opine more. But thank you for the question.
Good morning, and thank you for this. How do Christian nationalists dismiss the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? The founding fathers authored the amendments and the Constitution. How do they dismiss this?
They have a couple different ways. They have a couple of favored arguments. It's a good question, James. One of them is, well, show me where the words separation of state and church appear in the Constitution. Which you can't do because those words don't appear. Neither does right to privacy or separation of powers, right? It's separation of state and church is a convenient shorthand, and the wall of separation is a nice metaphor to sum up what could be a complicated legal topic otherwise. So Dan Barker also likes to point out that Christmas doesn't appear in the Bible. Norton, I think also Holy Trinity doesn't. Dan will let me know in the chat there. So that's one of their favorites. They also, another very popular one is to say, well, part of being a Christian nation is that really what they meant is that no particular brand of Christianity is going to be favored under the First Amendment, but Christians are favored above everybody else, which is like kind of the definition of Christian nationalism and not what the founders meant. So I mean, those are sort of their two most favored. I do get into a few of the other ones in the founding myth, if you haven't picked up a copy of that. And we do FFRF debunks a lot of these talking points on our website under the FAQ section. I think we even have an FAQ about separation of state and church not being in the Constitution. Thanks, James.
And just by the way, I did see one of the questions, since you brought up the founding myth, was do you have a title for the new book that's coming, and can you share that title?
The working title is not yet approved by the publisher, but I'm going to fight a little bit harder for this one, is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. I think it sums up nicely the argument without even having to crack the book, though you should. But yeah, it's still, the publication's not going to be, I believe, now until fall of 2021, though the manuscript's due in 239 days. Not that I'm counting.
I just wanted to point that whether it would be helpful or maybe overly inflammatory, because one thing that seemed to be analogous to me is the rhetoric expressed by Christian nationalists, and that expressed by ISIS, who were the Islamic nationalists. And you could take what they say, substitute God for Allah, and the speech sounds the same. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have not found it to be very effective. I know a lot of people like to liken Christian nationalists to the Taliban and things like that. I haven't found it very effective. It may be more effective post January 6th than pre January 6th. The one thing that I will say that I have found two things very effective: calling Christian nationalists Christian nationalists. So not saying they're dominionists or they're Seven Mountain dominionists or they're reconstructionists or they're Rushduni reconstructionists or any of the other possible names. Christian nationalism really explains what they believe and what they are trying to do concisely and well. And the feeling of that phrase is accurate. The feeling that it inspires in people who hear it is accurate in terms of what they are trying to do. So I really encourage everybody to drop all the other phrases that they use and adopt Christian nationalism. I mean, don't use it where it's you're not talking about a Christian nationalist, but it is certainly better. So, I mean, that to me is number one. And then number two is what I did in the founding myth, which is talk about it as un-American. Talk about Christian nationalism as un-American. That is not something they are used to. And the goal is to redefine America according to their identity. And they are not used to being pushed back against on that front. And it works. It absolutely works. So those are the two things that I encourage people to do when they are trying to have these conversations. And don't just slap the label on American on. Explain that there is this fundamental conflict between Christian nationalism and the founding principles of America. And that's what I try to do on every page of the Founding Myth, which you can get a signed copy of from FFRF. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom.
And that was Andrew Seidel, who is a constitutional attorney, who is the Director of Strategic Response for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, hosting our very first Coffee and Conversation. It's a Zoom event for members only. If you're a member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we will send you an invitation to the private members Zoom event. We're going to do another one in a month with two other attorneys of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. So watch your email or watch our announcement for that. We have a lot of different media. We have a radio show called Free Thought Radio, which is just finishing its 15th year with me and Annie Laurie Gaylor. We have a newspaper, Free Thought Today, which is now in 36 years. I think this is our 37th year of publishing. We have a blog called Free Thought Now, which is a Patheos blog. Of course, we have this show, Ask an Atheist, which is most Wednesdays at 12 noon Central, which you are watching. And next week, we will talk about a victory in Alabama. Liz Cavell and Patrick Elliott, our attorneys, will be hosting that show next week on Ask an Atheist, right here on Facebook Live. And we also have a national TV show called Free Thought Matters, which broadcasts on about a quarter of the market in major cities around the country. Free Thought Matters is also put up on YouTube, so you can watch the show the same week that it goes up. So that's our show for today. Tune in next Wednesday, 12 noon Central, for another episode of Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live.